If you're like us, you've probably seen references to something called Munchausen's by proxy and been curious, without really understanding what it is or how it may affect people. That's why we were excited to hear about the new podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me.
The host, novelist Andrea Dunlop, takes an in-depth look at this subject. No one has ever done this before. She talks with people who have been affected by this condition. She even speaks with a perpetrator.
We've already listened to the first 2 episodes, and we can tell you that Andrea doesn't dwell on the darkness. She takes great pains not to be gory or exploitative. This show has heart. It focuses on the humanity of everyone involved.
And what makes this podcast extra special is that Andrea has a deeply personal connection to this subject. Someone very close to her was investigated for Munchausen by proxy. That gives the show a real emotional punch. When Andrea is listening to people tell stories about how they've been affected by this condition, she is not some uninvolved outsider. She has lived through the very same pain they have. She understands them. And through this podcast, she helps all of us understand them too.
New episodes drop every Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Nobody Should Believe Me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder.
For years, Lucy returned to the house on Irving Place in her dreams. She'd fall asleep and find herself standing in her grandmother's living room, gazing out the window.
I used to have dreams about a checkerboard over and over, and finally, about 30 years ago, one day I asked my dad, I have this weird dream.
Her dad knew right away what she was talking about. Lucy's grandmother had rented out a room to a man who drove such a car.
And it turns out it was a sticker on the guy's car.
That man's name was Francis Bloeth. In 1959, he brutally murdered 3 people in restaurants across Suffolk County in Long Island. That was the summer that 9-year-old Lucy lived downstairs from a ruthless serial killer. My name is Áine Cain.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee.
And this is The Murder Sheet, a weekly true crime podcast.
Áine and I connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides. To help us understand the patterns of these crimes, we created a spreadsheet of nearly 1,000 eatery-related killings, the Murder Sheet. We'll be drawing on that data throughout Season 1 to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes.
We don't just rely on skimming the headlines. We dive into these cases to bring you in-depth coverage.
We're the Murder Sheet, and this is the other Long Island serial killer, Checkerboard Dreams.
One of the great things about having this podcast is it allows us to connect with all sorts of people with a unique perspective on the crimes we cover. So, we were very excited when we heard from Thomas Pearson, who had listened to our miniseries, The Other Long Island Serial Killer, and let us know that his cousin had a front row view to Francis Bloeth's arrest. We got in touch with her. She agreed to talk with us for the show, but asked that we give her a pseudonym. We decided on Lucy, which is not her real name.
Let's follow Lucy back in time to the summer of 1959, when she went to stay at her grandmother's house on Irving Place in Long Island's Islip Terrace.
I used to go visit, my parents were divorced, and I used to go visit my grandmother for the summer every few years, and I'd spend the summer there. So I would be staying at her house. My dad would come and visit me there, and I'd basically spend the whole summer with my grandmother. And I'd fly out from California. And this time I was 9 years old, and it was the summer in '59 that I stayed there when this happened. I loved going there, and you know, I wasn't around my grandmother or any relatives because my mother had moved away. My parents had divorced. My mother had moved to California. So I really wasn't around any family or anything. So, you know, in those days, those grandmas made everything from scratch. She could sew, she could cook and embroider and do all kinds of stuff. And I used to go out in the neighborhood and play around. I'm trying to think. That year, I believe I spent the winter there as well and went to half a year of school there. So that was cool because I was never around snow. You know, being in California, totally different setup. I lived in the beach area. I always thought everybody talked funny because they had a New York accent, although I was born in New York, but I was raised in California. And then the borders, it was him and his wife and a young child, you know, under age 1. During the day, I'd sit out on the steps sometimes, and he'd walk past me, and I'd say hi. He was very quiet. And then he'd go upstairs to the apartment upstairs, up through the front door and up to his apartment.
Would he say hi back?
Yeah, you know, but not carry on a conversation, kind of a hi, and then he'd be gone.
Did you ever talk to his wife?
You know what? I think I did, but not. I really, you know, it's been over 60 years. I don't really remember that part of it.
And do you have any sense or memory of how your grandma sort of got along with these boarders?
She seemed to like the lady. I think she didn't deal with him very much, but the lady had a young baby, and they seemed to get along. You know, she seemed to think they were nice people. They were pretty quiet, although we could hear them walking, you know, up above.
On the surface, nothing seemed to be wrong with Francis and Jane Bloeth. He was a 27-year-old construction worker. She was a 25-year-old mother to a new baby. They were a young married couple just starting out in life. Ideal tenants, you might say. But sometimes, at night, Lucy would hear strange noises.
What would happen is that every now and then my dad would spend the night, and I would be in one of the bedrooms. And during the night, it would wake me up, and there would be pacing, back and forth on the floor, and I could hear it, and it would wake me up and then keep me awake.
The killing spree started July 31st and ended on August 8th. Each homicide took place inside a Suffolk County restaurant. In the first case, Bloeth killed John's Delicatessen owner, Hans Hackman, in Islip. Next, he murdered Diane's Diner employee, Lawrence Kircher, in Smithtown. And in the final slaying, he took the life of Bailey's restaurant owner, Irene Currier, in West Hampton.
We'll include the links to our original 3 episodes on the case in our show notes, if you want to go back and get more details.
As fear over the murders swept across the island, Lucy fell ill. She was still stuck at home recovering on Monday, August 10th, 1959.
What had happened is I had been ill and I had a fever, and doctors used to make house calls in those days. And the doctor had just left. And I'm laying on the couch watching TV, I think it was, or just laying there. And I could see out the front window. And I saw all these people come up on the yard with guns and everything, and I started yelling at my grandmother, who was, of course, in the kitchen cooking. And Grandma, there's people out in front and they've got machine guns, you know. And she's yelling back at me, "You're delirious, you're sick," you know. And I'm going, no, there's people out in the front yard. And finally she walks out into the front, and then we see like the house was surrounded. Well, just at that point, my dad drove up because he knew I'd been sick and the doctor was there. And they made him put his hands up, you know, and they checked him all out. And he had to wait. I know they let him in finally, but only for like 15 minutes, and then he had to leave. But I remember they came in and went upstairs to where he lived. And I kind of remember them taking him from there, but I'm not 100% sure at this point. I thought they took him from there then. But then they stayed around a very long time looking at his vehicle. And I think that's where the vehicle parked out in front of the house, where the checkerboard that I couldn't seem to get out of my mind for years and used to dream about it. That's all they did that day that I can remember. But they kept coming back to search the house. I think they even drained the fanny system that they had there, and looking for bullets or anything like that.
Even though she was just a 9-year-old girl, Lucy got to help out with the investigation at a few crucial points.
Later on, when I was up and around, I went by the side of the garage inside where they couldn't reach because I was a kid, you know, I was little, and I found a holster there, and I brought it out, and they took that, of course. The way the garage was, and I'm trying to remember now, that it seemed like there was like just a small space all along the whole length of the garage. There might have been a fence, and I could go in there. They were looking for stuff out in the yard, and I was probably just hanging around and went in where they couldn't go and found a holster and brought it out. This is what I remember, you know. I think if I'd come out with a gun, they would have scattered, but the holster wasn't.
She also proved to be a key fixer for enterprising members of the Fourth Estate.
As a kid, I used to go outside, and the newspaper reporters used to come around, and they'd bribe me to get my grandma to come out, because after a while, she didn't want to come out and talk to them anymore. So they'd put me money, and I'd, "Grandma, come out here," you know. If I remember right, they caught me on the side of the house, and they say, "Hey, where's your grandma?" And I go, "She's inside." And they go, "Well, we would like to talk to her. You know, we're reporters." And I go, "Oh, she's probably not going to want to come out." And he goes, "Look, if you can get her out here, I'll give you $5. And I go, "Okay." And I can't remember how I got her outside. I probably called her out for some reason. And then they were standing there, and she couldn't go back in. So she, you know, gave him an interview. Now thinking about it, I thought, "Oh, you bad girl."
Hey, you know, $5 is $5. You got to do what you got to do.
Hey, you know, can you imagine what it is considered like now, between this and now? In 1959, $5 was a lot of money. I do remember looking at the newspaper article for the day I got my grandmother outside. I remember they had a picture of, you know, they were talking to her outside, you know, about, because she, of course, would have known more.
We found one such picture of Lucy's grandmother, Antoinette Galeazzi, that ran in the August 12, 1959 edition of Newsday. The landlady looks like a classic grandmother, with short, wavy hair and big glasses. She definitely looks annoyed, standing with her arms crossed as she speaks with two reporters. As Lucy noted, she gave a few quotes to the media in the days after Bloeth's arrest. She mostly talked about how Bloeth seemed like a good husband and that she was surprised about the charges leveled against him.
In true crime, those types of interviews, where neighbors and friends say a killer seemed like a nice guy, often elicit eye rolls. But then again, what are you supposed to say in that situation? If a guy who seems like a quiet, responsible family man who paid his rent on time turns out to be a serial killer, what can you do other than express shock and disbelief?
But it turned out there were a few subtle signs that Bloeth was up to no good. Detectives also asked Lucy and her grandmother to help establish a timeline of the serial killer's strange behavior.
And after all of this happened, I remember the police were trying to sit down with me and my grandmother and try to figure out the night I would go in and wake her up, saying I couldn't sleep because he was pacing back and forth. After we realized what was happening, that was kind of how they pinpointed the nights he would pace and the nights of the killing.
It's a chilling image. Francis Bloeth walking back and forth in his apartment, with night fallen outside, each step creaking just above Lucy's head. What sort of murderous frenzy was he falling into as he paced? But, as a kid, Lucy wasn't terribly scared in retrospect. Why should she be? Bloeth had never tried to hurt her or her grandmother. The raid on the house, the gaggle of reporters, that was all straight out of a crime movie. Exciting stuff for a kid spending a sleepy island summer at grandmother's house.
You know what, as a kid, I thought it was cool because of all the attention. And I remember my cousin calling up my grandmother and wanting to come over. And she wouldn't let him. So it was just she and I there that day. You know, until my dad came over for a very short period of time, and then he was gone. But I don't remember if the lady was upstairs or not. But we were the only ones there, and they thought it was cool too, and they wanted to come over. But I don't know if she didn't let them come over because of what was happening, or because I had been sick. You know.
Lucy was just 9 years old, so her family didn't go over some of the disturbing details about the case with her. They just told Lucy that Francis Bloeth, her grandmother's boarder, had killed people.
You know, they didn't really go into detail, probably because of my age. You know, I don't know how many people with first-hand knowledge really are left. My dad's gone, and of course my grandma. I don't think I realized what it was all about. Later on, I had this thing stuck in my head. As I said, because I was always taken out of the area and brought back to California, I was never around a lot of the other stuff that went on. But I remember the name, you know, Mad Killer. I thought it was Mad Killer in New York, but I guess it was Mad Killer something else. But it was pretty interesting. It was pretty interesting the way they were checking everything out.
Sadly, Lucy's grandmother passed away just a few years after the summer of the Mad Killer.
She was really, really cool. She was the Italian grandmother everybody wished they had, you know. And she didn't live, that was 59. I think she passed away in 63. So she didn't live long after that. You know what? She died about 3 or 4 years later. So I think that was probably the last summer thinking about it, that I had been there.
Later in life, Lucy would turn to other family members for answers.
I had questions about it later on, and because my mother really didn't know anything about it, and my dad was gone, and I really didn't have anybody I could ask except for my aunt, who has passed away now maybe a year or two ago, and she remembered most of it, and I used to call her, and her son was Tom, the one who contacted me. But she knew more about it, I think, from talking to my grandmother. And but she knew I had been there at the time. So I'd call up and I'd ask her, what was that guy's name again? You know, I was trying to Google it and see if I could find something on it. And the first thing I ever found on it was when Tom contacted me, and he sent me a little link.
That cousin was Thomas Pearson, the Murder Sheet listener who contacted us and connected us with Lucy. For Lucy, the memories of that summer faded, but the checkerboard pattern stuck to Bloeth's car found a home in her dreams.
It was about 30 years of it, and every, maybe once or a month or so, I'd have the dream. It's something that wasn't completed, I guess, in my brain. I never could understand. I knew I'd seen the house, and I was looking from the living room out to the street, and the car was parked in a parallel, and there was a checkerboard. Like, I don't know if it was in between the posts or on the door or something. So later on, I thought maybe it was a cab. I don't know what the man did for a living. I thought maybe it could have been a taxi cab, but I never connected it with the killing. And when my dad explained that it was one of the reasons they knew it was the right car, because I guess a witness had seen it. The only thing that stuck in my head was the checkerboard, until my dad explained what it was, and then I never dreamt the dream again.
Thanks to Thomas Pearson and to Lucy. To our surprise, we've gotten a number of requests from people saying they would like a way to help financially support our efforts with the show. So, if you are interested, we are relaunching a Patreon page, which you can find at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. Join us there for 2 live video question and answer sessions each month. You can ask us anything, suggest new cases for us to look at, or even offer ideas for new leads for us to follow. If Patreon is not your thing, you can buy us a coffee at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. Thanks for the interest.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Murder Sheet. As always, thanks to Kevin Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
To keep up with the latest on The Murder Sheet, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at murdersheet, and on Facebook at msheetpodcast, or by searching Murder Sheet. If you enjoy listening to The Murder Sheet, please leave us a 5-star review to help us gain more exposure. And send tips, suggestions, and feedback to murdersheet@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.